They say love has a strange way of finding us. Not when we are ready, not when we are searching, but often in the places we least expect. For Emma Carter, a woman whose life was measured by boardroom battles, high-stakes negotiations, and a calendar that rarely left room for anything other than work, love was the furthest thing from her mind. She was a name that carried weight in the business world, a woman who had climbed her way up from nothing and built a company worth millions. People admired her strength, her confidence, and her sharp instincts. But behind the tailored suits, the expensive cars, and the pristine glass office that overlooked the city skyline, there was a loneliness that no one could see. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when her story truly began. She was driving home after a grueling day of meetings, her phone buzzing with reminders of deals still pending, contracts waiting for her approval, and an endless chain of emails that demanded her attention. The windshield wipers moved frantically against the storm, but it wasn't enough to clear the heavy rain that blurred her vision. And then, without warning, her luxury car made a sound she had never heard before. A loud metallic grind, followed by silence. The engine died in the middle of a nearly empty street. She tried again and again, pressing the ignition, but the car refused to respond. Frustration filled her chest. This was the last thing she needed. Emma was the type of woman who planned every detail of her day with precision, and car troubles had no place in her schedule. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, stepped out into the rain, and searched for help. A small auto repair shop stood at the corner, its neon sign flickering faintly, almost as if it were struggling to stay alive in the storm. It wasn't the kind of place Emma Carter ever imagined herself walking into. She usually dealt with dealerships, with luxury service centers that served coffee on silver trays and had waiting rooms that smelled like leather and fresh polish. But tonight she had no choice. She pushed open the heavy door of the garage, the scent of oil and metal instantly wrapping around her. The space was dimly lit, tools scattered across workbenches, and the sound of rock music hummed from an old radio in the corner. A man emerged from beneath a car, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked nothing like the polished executives Emma was used to dealing with. His hair was dark and slightly messy, his shirt rolled up at the sleeves, and his hands bore the marks of years of hard work. He was rugged, with a presence that was quietly commanding, and when his eyes met hers, there was a steadiness in them that made her pause. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice deep, calm, and carrying no trace of judgment. Emma straightened her posture, instinctively defensive. She was used to being in control, to being respected, to never appearing vulnerable. "Yes, it just stopped. I need it fixed quickly." The man gave a small smile, one that hinted at patience. "They all stop eventually. Bring it around. I'll take a look." Something in the way he said it struck her. There was no attempt to impress, no rush to flatter her because of the expensive coat she wore or the diamond ring on her finger. He spoke to her like she was any other person who had walked into his shop on a rainy night. She hesitated, then nodded. Within minutes, her car was being rolled into the garage, and the man was already under the hood, his hands moving with practiced ease. As she stood there, Emma found herself watching him. There was something captivating about the way he worked, focused, precise, as if the rest of the world ceased to exist while he was solving the puzzle of an engine. She had spent her life surrounded by people who spoke in numbers, charts, and projections, but here was a man who spoke with his hands, with skill that needed no presentation. "What's your name?" she asked, breaking the silence. He glanced at her briefly, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Jake," he replied simply, then turned back to the car. "Jake?" she repeated, as if testing how the name felt on her lips. "Do you own this place?" "Yeah, been running it for a few years. It's not much, but it's honest work." That answer struck her harder than she expected. Honest work. It had been years since she had heard someone speak about their job with such plain sincerity. In her world, everything was about competition, growth, and image. Here, in this little garage, there was no pretense. The rain continued outside, hitting the roof of the shop like a drumbeat. Emma checked her phone. Messages were piling up. People were waiting for her decisions. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel the rush to respond. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and watched as Jake finished inspecting the car. "You'll need a new alternator," he finally said, standing upright and wiping the sweat from his forehead. "I can get one in by tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" she repeated, almost incredulous. She wasn't used to waiting for anything. When she wanted something, she got it instantly. But Jake's calm expression left no room for negotiation. "All right," she said reluctantly. "You'll need a ride?" he asked, his tone courteous but without insistence. Emma hesitated again. The idea of accepting a ride from a mechanic, someone she had just met, felt strange. But something about Jake made her feel unexpectedly safe. "Yes," she admitted quietly. The drive was short, but it felt longer because of the silence. Jake wasn't like other men she had known, who often tried to impress her with endless talk of achievements or wealth. He drove with focus, saying little, but when he did glance at her, it wasn't with admiration for what she represented. It was with curiosity for who she was. That difference unsettled her, but in a way that made her want to know more. When he dropped her off, she thanked him, expecting that to be the end of their interaction. But as she walked toward the entrance of her sleek apartment building, she realized that something inside her had shifted. It was small, barely noticeable, but real. The next morning, Emma found herself thinking about Jake before she even checked her emails. She told herself it was simply because of the car, because she needed to know when it would be ready. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the full truth. When she returned to the garage later that day, she saw him again, bent over her car, his sleeves rolled up, his hands moving with quiet confidence. This time, she noticed details she hadn't before. The way his jaw tightened when he concentrated, the way his hair fell slightly across his forehead, the way he hummed softly to the radio without realizing it. "Good news," he said, looking up with a smile. "It's fixed. Should run smooth now." Emma smiled back, a rare, genuine smile that surprised even her. "Thank you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the noise of the world fell away. It was just Emma and Jake, two people from different worlds, bound by a chance encounter in the middle of a storm. She had no idea then how much this meeting would change her life, how it would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and what truly matters. But as she stood there, with the rain still dripping from the edge of the roof and the faint smell of engine oil in the air, she felt something stir inside her, a spark she hadn't felt in years. And that was only the beginning. Emma told herself that once her car was fixed, she would never have a reason to return to that little garage. That was the sensible thing to do. After all, her life didn't allow for distractions. She had deals to secure, investors to satisfy, and a reputation to maintain. Yet, as she drove away from Jake's shop that day, the steady hum of the engine was drowned out by the memory of his calm voice, his honest smile, and the way his eyes had held hers with such quiet certainty. For the next few days, she tried to push the memory aside, throwing herself into work with the same relentless intensity that had carried her this far. But late at night, when the city lights glowed outside her penthouse windows and silence pressed against the walls, her mind would drift back to that rain-soaked evening. She found herself wondering what Jake was doing, whether he was still bent over some engine, his sleeves rolled up and his brow furrowed in concentration. It was absurd, she told herself. She was a woman who had built an empire from the ground up. What could she possibly have in common with a mechanic from a small neighborhood shop? And yet, a week later, she found herself driving past the garage again. She told herself it was coincidence, that she simply happened to take that street on her way to a meeting. But her eyes betrayed her when they lingered too long on the flickering neon sign and the sight of Jake working outside. She didn't stop. She couldn't bring herself to, but her heart beat faster at the sight of him, and that was enough to leave her unsettled for the rest of the day. The universe, however, has its own way of intervening when two lives are meant to collide. It was a Saturday afternoon when Emma's phone rang. Her assistant was supposed to handle all her calls, but this one came from an unknown number. Against her usual habit, she answered. "Emma Carter?" The voice on the other end was deep, familiar. Her breath caught slightly. "Jake." There was a pause, as though he wasn't sure if she'd remember him. "Yeah, sorry to bother you. Your number was on the paperwork you signed. I noticed something else with your car when I was closing up today. Nothing serious, but it might give you trouble later. Thought you'd want to know." Emma sat back in her chair, surprised. No one in her world ever went out of their way to warn her unless it benefited them. Yet here was Jake, taking the time to call her about a problem she didn't even know existed. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate that." "No problem. If you want, you can bring it by next week. I'll take care of it." There was something in his tone that was both professional and personal, as though he wasn't just offering a service but extending a quiet invitation. Without giving herself time to overthink, Emma replied, "I'll bring it in tomorrow." The next day, she pulled into the small garage again. Jake looked up as she arrived, and for the first time, she noticed the way his face lit up in recognition, as though he was genuinely glad to see her. It was a simple expression, free of calculation, and it sent a warmth through her chest she hadn't felt in years. As he worked on her car, Emma lingered nearby, more curious than she wanted to admit. They talked, at first about her car, then about small things, and eventually about life. She learned that Jake had grown up in the same neighborhood where his shop stood, that he had inherited it from his uncle after years of learning the trade by hand. He wasn't wealthy, but he was proud of what he had built, proud of the honesty in his work. Emma found herself opening up in ways she never did. She didn't tell him everything. She didn't say just how successful she was or how many people worked under her command, but she spoke about the pressure of her world, about the loneliness that came with power. Jake listened, not with polite nods or empty reassurances, but with real attention, as though every word she spoke mattered. Hours passed without her noticing. By the time her car was ready, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the shop. Emma realized she didn't want to leave. "Thank you again," she said, her voice softer than usual. Jake leaned against the hood of her car, looking at her with that steady gaze of his. "You don't have to thank me. That's my job." "No," she replied quickly, surprising even herself. "It's more than that. Most people in my life only do something if there's something in it for them. But you didn't have to call me, you didn't have to take this much care, and yet you did." Jake shrugged, his lips curving into a faint smile. "That's just how I was raised. You take care of people when you can. Life's too short not to." Those words struck her deeply, more than she expected. She had spent years building walls around herself, convinced that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But here was a man who lived by principles that seemed so simple yet so rare. That evening, Emma didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove aimlessly through the city, her thoughts tangled. She was drawn to Jake, not because of his looks or the novelty of their worlds colliding, but because of the way he made her feel seen, understood, human. Days turned into weeks, and Emma found more reasons to stop by the garage. Sometimes it was her car, sometimes just an excuse to ask him a question or bring him coffee. Each time, their conversations grew deeper. They talked about dreams, about regrets, about the kind of life they both wanted. Jake admitted he had once thought about leaving the city to open a bigger shop somewhere quiet, but life had kept him rooted here. Emma confessed that sometimes, despite everything she had achieved, she felt like she was still chasing something she couldn't name. One evening, as the shop lights flickered on and Jake was closing up, Emma lingered by the doorway. She had stayed longer than usual, reluctant to leave. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain from the afternoon. "Jake," she began, her voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said, turning toward her. "Do you ever feel like you're meant for more? Like there's something waiting for you, but you don't know what it is?" Jake studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think everyone feels that way sometimes. But maybe it's not about chasing something far away. Maybe it's about finding meaning right where you are." His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and grounding. Emma realized then that she wasn't just drawn to Jake. She needed him, not for his skills, not for what he could offer her, but for the truth he carried in his simplicity. She drove home that night with her heart pounding, unable to deny it anymore. Something was happening between them, something she couldn't control, something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but something she knew she couldn't walk away from. For the first time in years, Emma Carter, the woman who had everything money could buy, felt like she was standing at the beginning of something real. And deep down, she knew her life would never be the same. Emma woke the next morning with an unusual lightness in her chest. For years her life had followed a rigid rhythm: meetings, decisions, travel, strategy. Yet now, amidst all the schedules and obligations, there was a new pulse running through her days. She couldn't deny it anymore. Jake had become more than just a mechanic who had once fixed her car. He was occupying her thoughts in ways she hadn't felt for anyone in a very long time. Still, the contradiction nagged at her. She was Emma Carter, the CEO of one of the fastest-growing companies in the city, a woman admired and feared in boardrooms, a name whispered with respect in financial circles. Jake, on the other hand, was a man who worked with his hands, whose world was small, grounded, ordinary. The worlds they lived in could not have been more different, and yet, every time she stood near him, she felt more herself than she ever did surrounded by luxury. That week, after a particularly grueling day negotiating a merger, Emma found herself once again steering her car toward Jake's shop. It was late. The sun had already dipped below the skyline, and most of the city had gone quiet. She knew she should head straight home, collapse into bed, and prepare for another demanding day. But her heart guided her differently. When she arrived, Jake was just locking up. He looked surprised to see her, but not displeased. His tired expression softened into something warm. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying both curiosity and concern. "What are you doing here this late?" She hesitated before answering, suddenly aware of how ridiculous her presence might seem. But then she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "I just didn't feel like going home yet." Jake studied her, then gave a small nod. "Want to take a walk?" And so they did. Together, they strolled through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, past small diners, shuttered shops, and the glow of street lamps. Emma realized how rare it was for her to walk anywhere. Her life was usually chauffeured, rushed, planned to the second. Yet here, with Jake beside her, she felt a kind of freedom she hadn't tasted in years. They talked about everything and nothing. How the city seemed different at night. How Jake once dreamed of fixing classic cars. How Emma's favorite childhood memory was baking with her grandmother in a small kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and sugar. She surprised herself with how easily the words came. How natural it felt to share pieces of her life that she usually kept locked away. At one point, they paused on a bridge overlooking the river, the city lights reflecting on the water like scattered stars. Emma leaned on the railing, gazing at the view. "You know," she said softly, "I spend so much of my life chasing things, success, recognition, growth. But when I'm here, like this, it feels like maybe I've been chasing the wrong things." Jake looked at her, his eyes steady, filled with something she couldn't name. "Maybe you've just been chasing things you thought you had to. But that doesn't mean it's too late to chase what you really want." His words lingered in the air, more powerful than any motivational speech or boardroom advice she had ever heard. For a moment, Emma felt her defenses crumble, and she let herself imagine what it would be like to stop running, to stop proving, to simply be with him. The walk ended, but the memory of it stayed with her, weaving into her thoughts the next day as she sat in her sleek office surrounded by towering glass walls. She should have been focused on her team's presentation, but instead she found herself remembering the way Jake's voice had sounded against the backdrop of the river, calm and unwavering. The contrast between her two worlds became sharper with each passing day. At work, she was untouchable, calculating, always 10 steps ahead. With Jake, she was vulnerable, imperfect, human. It was a side of herself she hadn't allowed anyone to see in years, and it terrified her as much as it thrilled her. The more time they spent together, the more Emma realized how different Jake was from anyone else she knew. He didn't try to impress her with wealth or power. He didn't flinch at her sharp edges or her guarded silences. He treated her not as a CEO, not as an untouchable figure, but simply as a woman. One evening, After closing a major deal that her team had been working on for months, Emma found herself driving to Jake's shop again. She could have celebrated at a high-end restaurant with champagne and applause, but she didn't want that. What she wanted was to see Jake, to share her victory with someone who would care not about the money but about the effort it had taken. When she walked into the garage, Jake was bent over a car, grease on his hands and a smudge on his cheek. He looked up in surprise as she approached. "You look different tonight," he said, smiling faintly. Emma laughed, realizing she was still in her designer dress, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. "I just closed one of the biggest deals of my career," she admitted. "But instead of celebrating with my team, I came here." Jake wiped his hands on a rag, his expression curious. "Why?" The question hung in the air, and Emma hesitated before answering. "Because this feels more real, more important." Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, Emma thought he might kiss her. Her heart raced, anticipation crackling between them like electricity. But instead, he simply said, "I'm glad you came." It wasn't the declaration she expected, but somehow it was better. It was honest, grounded like everything else about him. Over the next few weeks, their connection deepened. They shared more late-night walks, more quiet conversations in the garage, more moments that blurred the lines between friendship and something more. Emma felt herself being pulled into a world she hadn't known she needed. A world where success wasn't measured by profit margins, but by authenticity, kindness, and the courage to feel. And yet, with every step closer to Jake, a shadow of fear followed her. She hadn't told him the full truth about who she was. To him, she was Emma, the woman with the broken-down car, the woman who showed up at his shop with coffee and stories. He didn't know she was Emma Carter, the powerful CEO who appeared in magazines and headlines. Part of her longed to confess, to lay everything bare. But another part of her was terrified that the truth would change everything. That once he saw the vast difference between their worlds, the fragile bond they were building would shatter. One night, as they sat on the hood of her car outside the garage, the stars scattered above them, Jake turned to her with a question that made her heart stumble. "Emma," he said quietly, "what is it you're really looking for? I mean, with all the time you spend here with me, what is it you want?" The question struck deep, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words. Her life had always been about wanting more. More success, more growth, more recognition. But as she looked into Jake's steady gaze, she realized her answer was simpler than it had ever been. "I want something real," she whispered. Jake smiled, and in that smile was an unspoken promise. Emma didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to plan every step ahead. All she knew was that she wanted to be here in this moment with him, and that was enough. The more Emma allowed herself to drift into Jake's world, the more the secret weighed on her. At first, it had been easy enough to dodge questions about her life beyond the garage. Jake never pushed and she never offered. He seemed content to know her as she was with him. A woman who brought laughter, curiosity, and a willingness to listen. But as their bond deepened, the silence around her true identity began to feel like a wall, one that grew taller each day. It haunted her even in the boardroom. Sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by directors and analysts, Emma found her mind slipping away from balance sheets and forecasts. Instead, she would picture Jake's hands covered in oil, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the unpolished honesty in his voice. She found herself wondering how he would react if he knew the truth, that the woman he was slowly letting into his heart wasn't just Emma, but Emma Carter, the multimillionaire businesswoman with a profile that occasionally made headlines. The thought terrified her. She had been loved before, or at least she thought she had. But those relationships always seemed tangled with her wealth, her influence, her name. She longed desperately for something different. She wanted to believe that Jake's feelings, whatever they were becoming, were for her and not for the empire she had built. But how could she ever be sure unless she risked losing it all? One evening, she arrived at the garage to find Jake waiting outside, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. He looked different, more serious, as though something was weighing on him. "You're late," he teased softly, though his tone lacked its usual warmth. Emma smiled faintly, trying to lighten the mood. "Some meetings ran over. You know how it is." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Actually, I don't. You never really talk about what you do." "Emma, I've known you for weeks now, and I still don't even know what kind of work keeps you so busy." The words struck her like a sudden gust of wind. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, dreading it. I guess I didn't think it mattered," she said carefully. Jake's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of hurt in it too. "It matters to me. I want to know you, not just the pieces you choose to show me. The real you." Emma swallowed hard, searching his eyes. She wanted to tell him, to let the truth spill out and wash away the fear. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with years of protecting herself. Instead, she whispered, "The real me is right here." It was true in a way. With Jake, she was more herself than she had been in years. But it was also a half-truth, and she knew it. Jake didn't press further that night, but the shadow of the conversation lingered. Emma could feel it in the pauses between their laughter, in the quiet moments when his eyes searched hers as though trying to read what she wasn't saying. The tension grew in the following days. Emma found herself caught between two lives: the polished executive whose face graced magazine covers, and the woman who shared late-night walks with a mechanic who didn't care about status. Every time she sat in her glass-walled office high above the city, she felt the distance between those worlds stretching further apart. Her assistant, Claire, noticed the change in her. "You've been distracted lately?" she remarked one morning as she placed a stack of documents on Emma's desk. "Is something wrong?" Emma forced a smile. "Nothing's wrong, Claire. Just thinking about things." But Claire wasn't fooled. She had worked with Emma long enough to recognize the signs. "Who is he?" she asked gently. Emma's eyes widened in surprise, then softened. "What makes you think there's a he?" Claire grinned knowingly. "Because you've got that look. The one you get when something or someone is keeping you awake at night." Emma laughed quietly, shaking her head. "You're too observant for your own good." "Well," Claire said, her tone warm, "whoever he is, I hope he knows how lucky he is." Emma's smile faltered. That was the problem. She wasn't sure he would feel lucky once he knew the truth. The breaking point came one Friday evening. Emma had promised Jake she'd meet him at the shop after work. But just as she was about to leave the office, her phone buzzed with an urgent call, an investor crisis that demanded her attention. She stayed late, hours slipping away until exhaustion blurred her vision. By the time she finally arrived at the garage, it was nearly midnight. Jake was there, sitting on the hood of a car, waiting. When he saw her, relief flickered in his expression, quickly replaced by frustration. "I thought you weren't coming," he said quietly. "I'm sorry," Emma said, her voice breathless from rushing. "Something came up at work." Jake nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Something always comes up at work, doesn't it?" The words cut deep. Emma felt her chest tighten. "I'm trying, Jake. I'm trying to be here." "I know you are," he said, his voice softer now, almost resigned. "But sometimes it feels like you're fighting a war I don't understand. Like there's this whole part of you I can't reach." Emma's throat ached with unspoken truths. She wanted to shout it out, that she was Emma Carter, that her world was built on power and responsibility, that she was terrified of losing him if he knew. But instead, she just whispered, "Please, don't give up on me." Jake looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I won't, but I need you to let me in, Emma. Someday soon." That night, as she lay awake in her penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling, Emma realized she was standing at a crossroads. She couldn't keep living a double life forever. The truth would come out one way or another, and when it did, everything they had built might either shatter or become stronger than she ever dared to hope. She closed her eyes, her heart aching with both fear and longing. One thing was certain: she was falling for Jake, and if she wanted to keep him, she would have to risk everything. The question was, did she have the courage to do it? Life seemed to flow more naturally for both Claire and Jack after that. They spent their mornings immersed in their own worlds. Claire leading her team with a renewed sense of purpose, Jack working in his garage with a calm confidence that only deepened over time. But the evenings, those were theirs. Dinner together, long walks, conversations that stretched into the night about dreams, fears, and everything in between. Claire found herself noticing things about Jack that others might have overlooked. The way he paused before answering, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted to give her the most thoughtful response possible. The way he always checked to make sure others were comfortable before he even thought of himself. The way he carried dignity in his hands, no matter if they were stained with grease or holding hers with tenderness. One evening, as the summer sun dipped low and painted the sky with strokes of gold and rose, Jack surprised her. He had been quiet all day, his mind clearly working on something. When they sat together on the hood of his car, eating takeout and watching the sunset, he finally turned to her with a look that made her heart skip. "Claire," he began, his voice steady yet filled with a depth that carried both nervousness and conviction. "I need to tell you something. All this time, I've been thinking that maybe you don't really see me for who I am. I mean, I'm just a mechanic. You're a businesswoman, living in a world so far above mine. But then, every time you smile at me, every time you sit here without caring about what anyone thinks, I realize maybe I've been wrong. Maybe you do see me." Claire's eyes softened, and she reached for his hand. "Jack, from the first moment I met you, I saw more than just a mechanic. I saw a man who didn't flinch when my car was broken down on the side of the road. I saw someone who takes pride in his work, who shows kindness in small ways that matter more than anything money can buy. And I'll tell you this, your world is not beneath mine. If anything, it's what's been lifting me up." The words hung in the air, honest and raw. Jack looked at her as though he was finally letting himself believe it, finally lowering the last wall he had built around his heart. Days turned into weeks, and soon Claire found herself weaving Jack into the fabric of her daily life. She introduced him to her closest friends, bracing herself for judgment, but instead found unexpected warmth. Her friends saw what she saw, a man whose quiet strength and authenticity made him impossible not to respect. But not everyone understood. Her business partners raised eyebrows. One even pulled her aside and whispered, "Claire, be careful. Men like him don't belong in your world. They'll only slow you down." Claire listened politely, but inside, she knew the truth. Jack didn't slow her down, he grounded her. He reminded her what it meant to live fully, not just achieve endlessly. Jack, too, faced whispers in his community. Some teased him, saying he was dating up, that it wouldn't last. He never responded with anger, only with a small smile and silence. Because deep down, he wasn't dating up. He was simply with the woman who made his world brighter. One night, after a particularly hard day at work for Claire, she walked into Jack's garage just as he was closing. Exhaustion clung to her, but the moment she saw him, something inside her lifted. She didn't say a word. She just walked up to him and wrapped her arms around him tightly, burying her face in his chest. Jack stood still, surprised at first, then slowly held her back, resting his chin on her hair. "Long day?" he asked softly. She nodded against him. "But it doesn't matter now, because I'm here." That moment was simple, but it was also everything. It was the moment Jack knew he didn't just love her. He needed her. And Claire realized she wasn't just falling in love with a man who fixed cars. She was falling in love with someone who fixed the parts of her heart she didn't even know were broken. The air was cool the night Claire invited Jack to an important event hosted by her company. It wasn't just another business gathering. It was a milestone celebration for a major expansion. The kind of night filled with champagne glasses, elegant gowns, and sharp suits. At first, Jack hesitated. He didn't belong in that world, and he knew it. But Claire looked at him with those determined eyes that always made him feel braver than he was. "Jack," she said gently, "you belong wherever I am, and I want you there with me." So he went. He wore his best suit. Simple, nothing flashy. And though he felt out of place among polished executives, Claire never let go of his hand. She walked into that room not with a business partner or a colleague at her side, but with the man who held her heart. The whispers started almost immediately. People glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with judgment. But Claire stood tall. She introduced Jack with pride, telling stories of his honesty, his work ethic, and the way he could make her laugh after the longest day. Some smiled politely, others exchanged knowing looks, but Jack didn't shrink under their gazes. He held himself with quiet dignity, and little by little, people began to see what Claire saw. Later that night, after the speeches and applause had ended, Claire stepped away to take a call. Jack wandered onto the balcony, away from the noise. He gazed out at the city lights, the hum of traffic below, the night sky stretching endlessly above. For a moment, he wondered how his life had led him here, from grease-stained afternoons in his garage to standing in a suit beside a woman who changed everything. When Claire joined him, she slipped her hand into his, leaning her head on his shoulder. They stood in silence, watching the city breathe. Then Jack turned to her, his eyes steady but filled with emotion. "Claire, I don't know what tomorrow looks like, or how we'll balance your world and mine. But what I do know is this. I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." Claire smiled, her eyes shimmering. "Jack, you don't have to, because I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a grand proposal, not the kind found in fairy tales with rings and rehearsed speeches. It was something quieter, something real. Two people choosing each other despite the doubts, the whispers, the differences that others said should keep them apart. Months later, Claire did something unexpected. She took a portion of her savings, not to buy another property or expand her empire, but to help Jack renovate his garage. Together, they transformed it into something more than a place for repairs. It became a community hub, a shop that trained young apprentices, gave jobs to those who needed a second chance, and treated every customer with the honesty Jack had always lived by. Standing in the doorway on opening day, Claire looked around at the buzzing crowd, then at Jack, who was shaking hands and smiling with that same quiet pride. She realized her dream wasn't just about building empires. It was about building a life worth sharing. And Jack? He realized he hadn't just found love. He had found a partner who believed in him more than he had ever believed in himself. They never rushed to the altar, never let society's definitions dictate their story. They didn't need a ring to prove what they already knew. They were building something stronger than promises made in a single moment. They were building a life together, day by day, choice by choice. And as they stood side by side, watching their new chapter unfold, both of them understood. True love doesn't always follow the script people expect. Sometimes it comes when your car breaks down on a random afternoon. Sometimes it's messy, inconvenient, unexpected. But when it's real, it changes everything. That night, as they locked up the garage and walked hand in hand under the quiet glow of the streetlights, Jack whispered, almost to himself, "Funny how the smallest things can change your whole life." Claire squeezed his hand and smiled. And sometimes, the smallest things turn out to be the most important. Together, they walked into a future that wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that made it beautiful.